Awesome. Well, guys, it's great to have you all here today. Young leaders. I mean, what makes a young leader? I kind of still feel at 41 that I'm young, but obviously I'm not because I'm asking the questions here. It's good to sort of hear from each of you. So today I've got Pierre.
Yeah, I'm Pierre. I'm married to Catherine, 3 kids. We planted a church just outside of Ipswich called Ripley. In the Ripley area, we're called Central Valley Church. So it's a new development area, so lots of new homes being built. It's one of those areas where they're expecting massive growth in terms of population. And so that's kind of the situation that we're in at the moment.
Adam, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Adam and I'm the pastor of Cross and Crown in Melbourne, a church that planted about a year and a half ago. And we're in an area of Melbourne that's highly Asian Australian. We're seeking to reach a lot of those tribes with the gospel. And then hopefully over the next year or so, maybe even a second congregation to do that.
And Scott, tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'm at Hunter Bible Church in Newcastle. We planted, and I oversee a campus that we planted about 3.5 years ago, kind of northeast Lake Macquarie, about 15 minutes south of the main area that we're meeting prior to that. And I also oversee kind of our ministry teams, leadership development at church.
Adam, I wonder if you can kick us off. What are some of the theological pastoral issues that your people are grappling with? And maybe give us a little bit of context about your church as well, just so we can, understand who you're pastoring.
Yeah, sure. We planted, I think it was February the 10th last year. So we're about 1.5 years in. Pretty young church, average age, you're dealing between 20 and 35, largely Asian Australian. What I've realized over the last few months in particular is a really, in one sense, underdone doctrine of sanctification, in that we've been pushing mission really hard, which has been great. But I think someone asked me the question the other week. They said, Adam, is the application from every Bible study and every sermon, share the gospel with someone and bring them into the kingdom? Which I think, it can come across a bit that way. And what it means is that people don't know what they're being saved for. So it feels like, okay, evangelize someone, bring them into the kingdom, then wait the next 60 years till the Lord returns or we go back to him. But there's no real bigger vision of what we're supposed to be. I think at the end of the day, people end up giving into sin because they give up on the possibility of change. So they think, I'm saved, that's it, and there's not much more beyond that.
What about you, Scott? Newcastle, very different from Melbourne, although there's aspects and parts of Newcastle that are Melbourne-like.
Great coffee.
What are you seeing at Lake Mac?
I think I'd affirm what Adam was saying in terms of people's identity and who they are and their ability to then transform and be changed by the gospel in putting off sin and growing to be more like Jesus. I think there's probably common ones that are kind of every day that people wrestle with. I reckon penal substitutionary atonement, an idea of God, a judgment-driven God, and that Jesus took that on the cross. Is a tough wrestle and one that we, I think, are at risk of not preaching and continuing to preach. Total depravity, just the ones that that are defeated beliefs for non-Christians as well, I think we're affected by our culture. They're key common ones. God's sovereignty, predestination, people are always wrestling with that. Men and women in ministry and how that looks. They're, common ones that I think have been ongoing that we'll keep seeing and keep needing to preach.
And Pierre, you're up in or just on the outskirts of Brisbane. Or is Ipswich considered its own sort of city? So you don't like being called, sort of from Brisbane?
Brizzy. No, that's no worries. So it's interesting. Like we're in a new development area. So I guess partially theologically, what some of the things that we're just wrestling with is we've got young families who are buying their first home, double income earners. And so there's a sense in which, when Jesus says it's harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to enter an eye of the needle. So it's how do you have a right view of all that you've committed your whole life, essentially work, everything to get possessions, to find some sort of comfort, security. How does the gospel at all impact that, relate to that. So I guess partially just thinking through both my people and the people, because we've got a lot of Christians that come to church, it's just going, how do you engage that theologically, going, actually, the gospel is more satisfying than the home you've just bought or the new job that you've got. And how do you make that real? So, and so kind of what Adam and was sort of mentioning with sanctification is, it's do you have a right view of what God is doing in your daily life? But yeah, kind of, I think for us, it's that big idea, just of wealth, comfort, security, amongst a whole range of others. But I think,
have you found, I guess the last 3 months, the impact of COVID, has there been a real pushback against this? I guess the secular story of have the house, 2 kids, and have the dream. Has that been sort of blown up, or have you been somewhat quarantined from it, so to speak, in Ipswich?
I find it interesting. I feel like Christians are talking more about COVID than our non-Christian neighbours, friends, and so it's fascinating that I think, in one sense, they're just trying to just do life in the midst of chaos, so a few of our neighbours have lost their jobs, have been on a hunt for jobs, but I was probably more concerned about their loss of job than they were, in one sense. And so, I think in terms of COVID, it kind of has sort of affected that narrative, but in another sense, it hasn't, because we are relatively still quite wealthy in Australia. We've weathered COVID a lot better than, I'm from Peru, so I talk to my family in Peru. It's horrible over there, and for a whole bunch of reasons. But we haven't faced that sort of impact as much as we have here. And so, in a sense, the narrative can kind of continue. Maybe they've asked a bit of existential questions about life, but on a whole, they're like, oh yeah, don't worry, we'll be all right. And yeah, the thing bad about is sports not being on. But yeah.
Now, Adam and Scott, you're ministering, to sort of a uni context, or sort of a recent graduate phase as well. Resilience has been one of the sort of things that has been said. The younger generation isn't resilient. Are you seeing that amongst your sort of Christian community, there's not a Christian resilience as well?
I've been pretty surprised at it, because the shift from when, we're young leaders, I'm not that old, but if you just rewind 10 years, the attitudes towards resilience have shifted pretty quickly over the last 10 years. So I've been surprised at helping people through church, not just through things like anxiety and depression, but even things like sleeplessness, and even things like taking medication to help them rest. And that's something that I wasn't as familiar with beforehand entering into this. But yeah, I think people feel like there's a lot on the line, and they're afraid of losing their jobs, even though they're actually in very secure industries. But I think what we've realized is it's really easy to knock the prosperity gospel, but we've got our own form of security gospel, which is, I don't need to be super rich. I just need to be very comfortable. That's
helpful. Scott, can I go to you? What's your outlook for the future of Australian Christianity?
I think I'm confident in the gospel. I think God's going to keep growing his kingdom until he returns. So I'm optimistic that he's going to keep using us. He's going to keep raising up people. I do have probably the area of concern I do think isn't around resilience in raising up the next generation. So I oversee our MTS program at church as well. And I think we've seen a subjective increase in probably lessening of people's capacity of our MTSs, increases in mental illness that have objectively been shown in our culture as well. And a book recently by Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, he's done research into Australia and showing the same trends are happening in Australia. A lot around particularly our parenting and a culture of overprotectionism in parenting. So he talks about the shift from helicopter parenting, where you've got you kind of parents just hovering ready to jump in and help, to lawnmower or bulldozer parenting, where parents are now going forward and getting rid of obstacles in their child's way, and increasing incidence of that even happening at university, where parents will come in and hassle lecturers and things like that over little Johnny's marks. That coming from our theology of comfort, as well as maybe a lack of just understanding in the gospel that we're called to take up our cross and follow Jesus. In the West, across the West, not just in Australia, we're seeing a decreased incident of people moving into full-time ministry. And so there's a real question mark in Australia, but not just Australia, but in the West and in our Western comfort, of whether we are raising up the next generation. And alongside that, though, still confident God's going to be at work. He's going to be growing his kingdom and saving people. So
I'm interested to hear what the others think. I mean, Brisbane and Melbourne, very, very different scenes to Newcastle. Are you seeing the same thing? We're not seeing a whole bunch of guys moving themselves into Christian ministry. It's a hard road ordinarily, but it's an even tougher road potentially now to sort of put the hand up and go into full-time gospel ministry.
We had a raising up sort of gospel workers event over Zoom last Friday. I was surprised we had 20 people. So for a church of 100, that's not a bad proportion of people who are keen to go into it. I think it's a plausibility thing for our guys. I think they just haven't seen anyone really do it who's like them. So if you pick our average cross and crown young uni student who's studying arts law or comm law or something like that, for them to walk away from that to do a traineeship is a pretty big deal. We should have 2 lined up next year. So hopefully, if you can get a pipeline going through that will make the difference. But we just haven't had much of a legacy or tradition of it, at least in Melbourne. So,
Yeah, in Brisbane it's interesting, isn't it? I'm probably more like, I'm just a positive person anyway, but my outlook for the future of Australian Christianity is pretty hopeful. Like I started reading, I just finished a book by 12 Hard Questions by Sarah McLaughlin or whatever, and she kind of talked about how the gospel grew in the midst of slavery. It's quite fascinating. She dealt with a whole bunch of range of questions, but I look at Brisbane and I feel, in one sense, the formal sense of ministry isn't happening. So that, sure, there's a decrease in theological studies, there's less of an MTS vibe, but I think I'm just seeing more people willing to sort of go, I want to serve God in my workplace, which I grew up in Sydney. So when I went through uni, I almost had this shift of people were told, get a degree. So whether you're a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, and then once you got your degree, throw it away and go into MTS and become a full-time ministry worker. Now, I came from Western suburbs. I was a carpenter. And so for me, it's just like, why would you do that? Like, why don't you equip your people to do their work well in a Christian sort of framework, in a gospel-centered way? And so I'm kind of seeing in Brisbane, sure, there might be not as many young people getting into full-time ministry, but at the same time, I don't know the stats on it, but there's heat. Like, I've got a guy who wants to go in full-time ministry, who's been my student minister, another guy that's coming on board next year, God willing, to church plant, but he's studying at QTC, and he wants to just serve at our church. So, like, in one sense, it's probably not happening as the wave was when I was younger, but it's still going on, and I'm pretty hopeful if the gospel's going out. And like even considering Geneva Push is trying to address a wave that's saying Christianity is kind of fading out, and we're going, hey, let's work hard at planting churches, reaching established churches, and making sure, that's a massive shift. I think, like, historically speaking, we're thinking a bit more strategically than we have before. In one sense, we're more connected globally, so we get a sense in which, hey, there are things going on. Can we push against that? But not. So I'm a bit more hopeful. I think in Brisbane, it's very different to Sydney and Melbourne for sure. But and maybe that's why I'm a bit more hopeful, less jaded, less cynical. But I don't know.
Brisbane is a very different place. It's like for us down here, that the Theology of Work stuff comes through with, I guess, flattening the distinctions between social justice and gospel proclamation, that they're effectively the same thing. They're both mission, do whatever you want. So it's much harder for us to be able to push gospel priority without sounding like we're grumpy old men saying that everything else is worthless, which we're not. But I think that's the context that we're in down here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just grumpy young men here saying that. So I agree, like that theology of work. I think the gospel is of first importance, and we need to keep putting that before and working out. I hear what Pierre's saying. We've got to keep equipping people in the workplace, not just going, you've got to be in full-time ministry. If you're not in full-time ministry, then you're not actually serving Jesus. That's wrong. We're serving Jesus in everything that we do and glorifying him in everything. And yet I am worried that if there's only one Bible college in Australia that is growing in our numbers, who are going to lead churches? And there are pathways, there's bivocational pathways and things like that we can think about doing, but who's really going to give up their secular jobs to then spend full time doing the work of the Lord, gospel proclamation, and equipping the saints for those things as well?
So we told our guys that I think everyone should ask the question, should I go into gospel ministry? Most people will say no. But if everyone was asking the question, more people would say yes than currently are.
Yeah.
So it sounds as though there is a hopefulness there, but there's a recognition that we don't have a great pipeline, that we don't have a whole bunch of people we're not holding people back from going to college. We're actually wanting to encourage more into that vocational pathway. Now it's interesting, NCLS stats, 2016, then they're now fairly old, and there'll be another census next year. But for the first time in decades, the decline in the church sort of plateaued out. Now that's obviously because of Geneva Push and the church planting they've been doing. But are you hopeful that we will see? You're all church planters. You've all started new things. Are you hopeful that we will, see the church, start to climb out of that and actually reach more people across Australia?
I think so. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, I think if the culture continues to get more hostile, it will continue to refine us and grow us even more.
Yeah, one of the big changes that's been happening in Australia, Australia's always had a multicultural heritage, but more recently we are seeing the growth in the subcontinent. So Indians, Asians. We're seeing the growth of Mandarin speaking Chinese into Australia more recently. With COVID, we've really seen, a loss of international students. So in some senses, it's been slowed down, but you can see the government's really trying to ramp that up back again. In terms of non-English speaking background, in terms of internationals coming to Australia hearing the gospel, what's your sense of what it might look like in the next 10, 20 years for the church in Australia?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting. I was in February. I was just in Peru, and my uncle, Dio Jesus, so his uncle Jesus, he's a pastor. His son was going into full-time ministry, and it was fascinating him asking, "What's it like sharing the gospel in Australia?" And I said, "It's so different for them. Everyone in South America believes in God. Like even if they don't, they'll say they do, just because it's just culturally what you do." So I almost feel like, when I grew up then in the western suburbs of Sydney, so very multicultural, there was less of a tension about a belief in something or God. Like that made it so quite easy to talk about God. The school I went to was predominantly Muslim, and most of them wanted to debate any Christian about their faith. Like it wasn't awkward. So I almost feel like if our international immigration continues to grow, that I guess that the media portrays that secular world is the West is sort of done with God. That's old news now. The rise of the secular West is we've matured. We don't need that type of framework. It's just a lie when you consider how Christianity is growing internationally and how often people from different countries. Well, I can only speak from South Americans, but God, you just wouldn't view life without God, and so. You almost, I think, there would probably be a shift then how we approach Christianity, rather as a apologetic as more like, how do we ground them in the truth of the gospel and see the richness of that rather than some counterfeit gospel. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but Adam probably had more to say in terms of just our Asian demographic. But yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. 49% of Australians right now are either first or second generation migrants. And it's really hard sometimes to talk about Australia and how to reach Australia with the gospel, where there's so many different subcultures. And so there's no one size fits all approach on that level. It makes me think that the ways in which you do church might have to change somewhat. I remember growing up in a Chinese church and then moving to a predominantly Anglo church. And my first thought was, don't these people like each other? Which isn't true. Like they do like each other, but the individualism of it meant that people would go to church, they'd go home, see each other maybe at small group, and then that's about it. Whereas a lot of Asian cultures, you just spend all day, every day with each other. And that's a pretty different way to do church. And I think sometimes even when we preach, like Pierre was saying, I think sometimes we're preaching towards the angry anti-theist who just really isn't in our church anyway. But actually the predominant non-Christian in our church is one that believes in many gods.
Yeah, in Newcastle, our uni church, we've got a predominant amount of international students. I would say that in terms of the people we're seeing become Christians, our international students are probably the more fruitful in terms of who we're seeing become Christians. And so we're thinking then as well, how do we build structures for them to love them and integrate them with church to try and cross those boundaries? And hospitality has been a huge impact in terms of how we're thinking about doing those ministries. But then also we've got an opportunity where a lot of those international students are going back. And so how are we equipping them with the gospel to go back to their home churches to be evangelistic wherever they're going?
So you go ahead.
I would love to see a stop thinking about ethnic ministry in terms of there are some churches that reach the Asians and the rest of us reach normal people. Like actually 49% of Australia are first or second generation migrants. This is something that every church needs to care about.
Amen, brother.
So pushing into that, what would it take to see Australia move forward in Christianity? Why is the Christian church not growing? Is this a key part that we're not addressing the non-English speaking background person? We're not reaching the second generation migrant.
I think that's one key part of it. I think again, Australia is pretty diversified, not even in terms of ethnicities, but even states. So it's funny, like I care more about Melbourne than I probably do about Asian Australian ministry. But Melbourne's on track to be the biggest city by 2026. On current stats, we already are. But it's just, the ABS includes Wollongong and excludes Geelong. But there's a problem there, right? Because if Melbourne's the biggest city and each city has its different culture, but the center of gravity for evangelicalism has traditionally been Sydney. That's actually a big problem when it comes to reaching Melbourne and the rest of the country, because we don't take anything that comes from the north. And part of that is, it's a naive, immature inferiority complex, and that we just got to shake that. But another part of it is they're pretty different places. And so I think we need to have diversified strategies.
It's not just a Christian, it's not just a Christian thing. It's an everything, it's a cultural thing. So that's, I guess, a helpful thing to point out. It's not just Christian. It's not a problem just amongst the Christians, but it's actually a problem amongst secular space as well.
But we've got to reach Australia together. So I think it's actually just listening to each other to say, okay, there isn't a single method to it.
So greater collaboration, is that what you're putting forward there then, Adam? Or listening to the smaller cities like Sydney better? Is that what you're saying? I'm trying to work out.
I think now
that Sydney's become the smaller city, we could say, look, hey, it's not, size doesn't matter, Adam.
No, it doesn't.
It's not about how big your city is.
You can say that now. Wait for 6 years' time. I think, we do need to listen to each other, and we approach ministry in fundamentally different ways. And I think it's worth listening to how we approach ministry and learning from one another.
Yeah, I'm interested. Are you seeing a greater sense of, just in the last sort of 5 years that you guys have been involved in, ministry, actually getting a sense of what's happening outside of your own patches? Like Adam, I know, you've got mates who've planted churches in in Brisbane, in Perth. You've visited them and seen them. You've actually left Melbourne for a time just to see what's happening around the place. If I think about Brisbane and Queensland, that's probably our most conservative state. So in some senses, it's more open to the gospel, even though, everywhere's pretty close to the gospel. It's more open to the gospel than other states just because of its conservative traditions. Are you hopeful that there'll be greater collaboration amongst the next generation of leaders?
At least among my friends, I think those friendship networks make all the difference.
Yeah.
You learn from each other and you inspire it becomes a plausibility structure. If someone else could do it there, you think, my gosh, maybe we could do it here as well.
Mm. Yeah, there is a sense though that ministry's just busy and you just want to keep your head down, and Brisbane's a big enough city, Newcastle's a big enough region. I just need to invest in that. Likewise, Melbourne, Melbourne, it will be the biggest city in Australia. I just need to spend time working down there. Is that the answer, just to keep working in your patch, planting churches, seeing growth happen, or do we actually need to see churches planted in Sydney, in other places around Australia as well?
Well, the gospel's to the ends of the earth, right? So it's not just Australia. I think we need to keep. We don't want to run churches thinking about the gospel's for our church or for our city. We need to be keeping on thinking about not just who are we going to collaborate with, and that's really helpful. And there's mentoring, and I've found Reach really helpful for this. Geneva, in terms of the networks there, building relationships, coming out of college, those kind of relationships have been integral. But within our churches, we need a mindset beyond our church walls and thinking about who are we sending, who are we equipping, who are we going for the sake of the kingdom beyond Australia as well.
Yep. What's it going to take to push our people out of that comfort mindset that you all sort of spoke into at the start as well? There's a big shift theologically in how we're thinking as well, but are we just too comfortable as a Christian church in Australia?
In one sense, yeah, we are. Like actually, when you first said the question, if I was asked, what would it take to see Australia move forward in Christianity, my first thought was prayer, persecution, and suffering. I'm not a morbid person. I just think there's a sense in which I think we need to know that the stakes are real, and that what we need to feel the rub of what I believe is true, and feel it emotionally, or like the whole range aspect of it, and just to go, yes, I do want to take this to my neighbour. I do think, regardless of the pushback or the persecution that I might face, I think Christians have the most valuable voice in the context of suffering and heartache and loss and brokenness. And we're just so comfortable that, as I said, my non-Christian neighbour loses his job and he's not even that, freaked out. Though I talk to my cousins in Peru, they've lost their jobs, and that's massive. Like, there is no income for them. There's no government help. There's no any of that. And so for them, that existential crisis is massive. Like, it's really big. So I wonder if, it will take for things to get roughed up a bit in the Australian, like, in one sense, what will be the outcome of COVID? Not that I'm looking forward to times being tough, but I wonder if that could be a helpful just engagement of going, are we legit about the gospel, or is this just a comfort thing?
Because the natural temptation and desire of most people would be, can we return church to what it was? And so we're trying to stop using the word back when we think about moving forward in terms of what church could be. And you want to be sensitive to where people are at, but actually there's a real opportunity to collectively as a church think about sacrificing our comfort for the sake of others. And now's a good time as any.
Yeah, I think in our preaching, our response to the gospel, we need to keep reminding our flock and ourselves that it's our whole lives. We take up our cross, like that's the Christian life. The paradox of the Christian life is fullness in God and experiencing Him, and the joy that comes is through serving Him at the cost to ourselves. So we lose our lives to save our lives. I think we're still preaching empowered by grace, but our response is that hard work for the sake of the gospel.
Now, guys, you've all started new things. You've all planted churches. I what what's a question I want to push into here? What made you, I guess, feel confident enough to go ahead with that, with the starting of the new thing?
I don't know if I've ever.
Sorry, Scott Curtis. Sorry to interrupt you, Scott. Scott Sanders, can you just give us that question again?
Yeah.
Got us enough smooth.
I know. I was just trying to. I didn't know whether to go into an established church question. They're all planners. I was wrestling with. Why didn't you guys just go and work with an established church? Why go start a new thing? I don't know if that's a better.
I think it's okay to ask that question in a friendly tone, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Got to make sure my answer's friendly then.
So, guys, you've all planted churches. You've all started new things. Why do that rather than go and work in an established church and be part of an established team, and see an existing church, stronger, healthier?
I'm in a situation where I've planted but still part of an established church in a sense. So
you've got the best of both worlds.
I know. But part of that was the reason we planted was to reach more people with the gospel. So my plant was a campus plant, and so we moved 15 minutes further south of where we were originally meeting, and that was because Newcastle, Lake Mac, there's kind of this slight geographical divide. And we wanted to reach 200,000 people further south with the gospel. And so that was a driving factor for planting. In terms of where I was at, in terms of ministry, readiness and all those kind of things, it was a perfect situation for me to still have that support of that established team and yet plant out.
I can only wish I had that. That sounds amazing.
It's been lovely. Yeah.
Praise God for that church that you're going to be part of that team. I mean, it felt a bit like the suicide run doing our one, just a scratch plan with 24 people going, we've got no money, no location, we've got absolutely nothing. Let's just try and do some damage for the gospel. And I think what motivated us in doing it was thinking in terms of the needs in Melbourne and how many churches are there right now that are trying to reach the particular sub-tribes that we're trying to reach. And there are some, but there's not near enough. And maybe it's a young man's impatience. It could be that, and trusting that God will work through that all the same, not to excuse it. But the needs are just so great. And I just think to myself, yes, there is wisdom in waiting. And for some people, and probably for me, there could have been greater wisdom in waiting. But my gosh, just there's so many people for every moment that we wait or don't do something. If it's not me, just send someone, right? Someone do something to reach these guys with the gospel.
I actually didn't originally I didn't want a church plant just yet. I was keen to just work at an established church, get a bit more experience. It was actually my mentor who just said, nah, don't do that. I think you should plant. And so I think in that sense, what convicted me during that time was me and my wife were kind of looking at different church options of established churches. And I just caught myself evaluating ministry in that, okay, what is most secure? This church can provide me this position. It's quite good. And I just remember Catherine and I just praying one day and just going, we never got into this. We never got into full-time ministry to play it safe. We got in because we love Jesus. We want to see his church built up. We want to see the lost reached. And that was when I guess what my mentor was sort of telling me or sort of clicked in, and church planting just made a lot of sense. Not that I thought, I wasn't impatient. I guess I was passionate about stuff, but I wasn't like, I just want to do my own thing because I'm sick of, being under people. But I think I realized that actually I just want to see the gospel go out. And this is one of the most effective ways in Australia, if not what God has been doing for thousands of years, is to plant churches to reach the lost. And we're kind of like, yeah, let's do it.
Pierre, you spoke about a mentor encouraging you and pushing you into planting and starting something new. Who are you currently learn from at the moment?
Yeah, so look, I worked at a church in Middleton, and during that...
Sorry to interrupt here. We had a bit of lag. Scott Sanders, could you ask the question again?
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Pierre, you spoke about your mentor, pushing you and really planting on the radar for you. Can you tell us who are you currently learning from? Who are you currently getting inspired by?
Look, so my mentor's a big factor. So I worked in a church in Middleton where I met Derek Hanna, who I think a lot of people And I remember he was still pastoring Village Church at the time, and I remember just going up to him, just going, "Hey, Derek, can you just mentor me?" And he, I thought, here's this busy bloke who a lot of people were wanting his attention, and I just said, "Oh, look, I just want someone older than me, experienced than me, that can just walk through ministry with me." And it's been over almost 5 years now that he's just sort of just seen me and grow. But I think I've always had this, and maybe I was sort of rebellious when I was young. I hated older men not catching up with younger men. It just grated me. So I used to go to my local church and go, "You're an older bloke. Here's a training thing. You're going to train me. Let's go." And I think I was just always wired that way. I just will do it. But I think it's because I know how dumb I am. And so I know that if it's just up to me, I'm going to be really selfish. I'm not going to push myself into areas that I can't see. I won't see those weaknesses or those sins that need to be addressed. And so, so I have a few people like that. So Derek is one. Scott Muir, who's the pastor at Central Church, who kind of speaks into that as well. And then I've got some other older Christians who I just go to all the time. I just need you to probe my heart. I need you to push me. And they just do it with such grace, but such boldness that, it pushes me out of myself to go, "Hey, yeah, this isn't about me." And I just massive, I think, for ministry, to have that.
Adam?
Look, Geneva assessment was actually really good. That gave me some confidence, not in myself. If it all hit the fan, I'd just turn around and blame you guys. But that was actually really helpful. But on a personal level, Andrew Reid, who was my pastor back at Holy Trinity Doncaster and is now planted a theological college in Singapore, first person to get me thinking about planting a church. I resisted it for 3 years. Even through assessment, I didn't want to do it. But he was persistent and probably knew what was best. And then Peter Adam down here, just what Pierre said, probing my heart, helping me through the life of a pastor, but more importantly, the life as a believer, and keeping me going now, setting me up well for the long haul. So those two older godly men have just been amazing. Yeah.
I think throughout my Christian life, being a Christian 11 years, I think I can always see we've had a culture. I became a Christian where I am now at HBC, and just culture of guys meeting one-to-one. And then eventually Sam Hilton tapped me on the shoulder and did MTS under Sam, and then stayed on with the staff team. And I think our staff team, just godly men and women, sitting under Greg Lee, that's just been an awesome experience. Beyond that, though, even though we had that culture, we still went through the Geneva assessment process to think about planting. And that was a really helpful experience. It raised blind spots for us to work on as we went into that. And John Warner was my coach out of that, and he was just superb at asking tough questions all the time. And so just felt really well supported, and those ongoing relationships have been awesome.
Great. So you've all really pushed into investing in younger leaders. You've all spoken about the importance of older men investing in your Christian lives and your Christian growth. I kind of want to finish on this question. What do you want to say to older Australian church leaders? So they're over 45, so let's give a boundary there. But if you had a whole bunch of older Christian men men and women in the room who have been part of churches for a number of years, what would you say?
Oh, invest in young people. Just pursue them. I think, I'm probably a bit more passionate than this. It's just do something. You've got an experience, and be patient with us younger fellas, because we are a bit more insecure. We think we know better. So push past that and just go, "Hey, look, can I sit with you? Can I just disciple you? Can I at least mentor you, walk you through some of the experiences I have?" But just do it. Take that opportunity to invest in younger lives. Even if it seems they're not enjoying it, God will work through it. And I just think Please do, because you have, God's doing something in your life in which I haven't sort of reached, and you're able to speak in ways that will just breathe life and encouragement and yeah, just fire that can keep us with the gospel. So just do something would be my encouragement, and don't be scared about it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think we're young and dumb, so it's true. We need those boundaries. So put the boundaries there, but I think we will probably learn best through failure as well and through risk taking. So, you can put the flags up and say swim between the flags, but let us go and swim. That'd be great.
Yeah, I reckon the posture towards younger leaders is, the key word authenticity that gets thrown around. But I wonder if opening up and showing vulnerabilities, we're all inadequate, we're all incompetent for the task of ministry. And so being honest and open about that, I wonder if my picture of older people in ministry is that they're superhuman. And there is a sense we are empowered by God's grace, but I think showing that love, care and support that may not always come naturally. And yet at the same time, I think the next generation with that love need us to push hard and keep pushing and being demanding and encouraging us to take up the cross and follow Jesus.
So one final thing, just real brief, short snapshot from each of you. What's your hope for your church at the end of this season? Adam?
I'd love for us to exit, if COVID is the season that you're talking about, we've got some non-Christians who've been joining us since we've been online. I'd love to step out of this, seeing them come to faith in Christ and being able to baptize them into our family. That'd be amazing.
I think we're in a similar boat. We've had just non-Christians kind of tap in, and I think I want our church to come out of this having a deeper sense, a deeper conviction about the church, what it means to gather, to be together, to be the body, what it is to build each other up, and what it is to see mission happen through a community that is doing that well. And so, yeah, there's quite I wish I could name them, but I just don't, in case they watch this. But if I would love for these non-Christians that we're in contact with to just come to faith. They're right there. And so I'm looking forward to once they are able to join our community again, just to see a community that's living out the gospel. I hope that would be the season we come out, just the church hungry for the gospel, both in their lives and the lives of others.
It's going to be hard for you to follow that, Scott. Other than making disciples, what are you hopeful for?
Look, I think growing in perseverance, like having realizing we're not in control, grown in our dependency on God, recognition of his sovereignty. He's growing his kingdom. Like we've seen him continue to grow his kingdom throughout this time. And so just an increased confidence in the gospel that would lead us towards more evangelism and resilience in preaching the gospel in the face of persecution, suffering, not just kind of brokenness of this world suffering, but putting our reputations on the line for the sake of the gospel.
Great. Well, it's been really good talking with you today. If you're looking for a church just outside of Ipswich, give Pierre a call. If you're looking for a church in Melbourne, Melbourne's a big place. There are lots of churches. Get in contact with Adam. He'll be able to point you in a direction in that really big city. And in Newcastle, if you're looking for a church as well, you look up Hunter Bible Church. A fantastic place to get along to. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks, Scott.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having me.